Welcome to the Affirming Minds Podcast, where we equip like-minded mental health professionals with a therapeutic toolkit that helps add to a more engaging, fulfilled, and effective mental health practice. Each empowering episode can stand alone as a continuing education pod course or a very valuable professional or personal resource with insightful expert interviews, practical resources, industry news, and lots of inspiration. We help the modern therapist thrive at work. Now let's welcome your host, a dedicated therapist and passionate educator, Shaina Siber, LCSW.
Welcome to the Affirming Minds Podcast. I'm your host, Shaina Siber. I'm so happy that you tuned in today. This show is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional treatment or clinical supervision. If you're in need of support, please reach out to a licensed mental health professional in your area. Whole clinical examples shared are fully de-identified composites or vignettes. No real client information is ever disclosed. If you're interested in earning continuing education credits for this episode, head to affirmmentalhealth.com. Our membership gives you access to CEs for live virtual workshops, self-study webinars, and eligible podcast episodes right here on the Affirming Minds podcast. When most people hear the word hoarding, they picture stacks of newspapers, crowded hallways, or the TV show Hoarders. But hoarding disorder is about so much more than the things that pile up. It's about the emotional and relational patterns beneath the clutter, patterns of avoidance, trauma, attachment, and dysregulation. And while hoarding disorder deeply affects the individual, the impact on families and loved ones is just as profound, shaping safety, relationships, and even long-term health outcomes. At its core, hoarding reflects how people try to feel safe and in control in a world that often feels uncertain. It also mirrors our cultural tension between scarcity and overconsumption, but the cost is steep. Fractured relationships, children growing up without safe spaces, and families carrying the heavy emotional weight of someone's illness. To help us unpack this, I'm joined by Ceci Garrett, MSW and licensed independent clinical social worker, a nationally recognized expert who has given a TED Talk, been featured on Hoarders, and presented widely on hoarding disorder. Ceci brings both lived experience as the child of a parent who hoarded and professional expertise as a clinician and educator. Her mission is to destigmatize hoarding and equip families, communities, and professionals with the tools they need to respond with compassion and effectiveness. In this episode, you'll learn how to distinguish clutter, collecting, and hoarding, and why the difference matters, the hidden emotional toll on families and children of those who hoard, why forced cleanouts don't work and what harm reduction looks like instead, practical strategies for clinicians and loved ones, including validating experiences, setting compassionate boundaries, and breaking cycles of accommodation. A quick thank you to our sponsor, Jane. Jane is an all-in-one practice management software that helps therapists and wellness professionals run their practices with ease. If you're ready to make the switch, use the link in the show notes and the code AFFIRM1MO for a 1-month grace period. This is such a powerful conversation that will expand your understanding of hoarding disorder, not just as too much stuff, but as a deeply human struggle with enormous impact on families. So let's get into it. Ceci, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to get into the conversation today. We were just talking a little bit offline and just about how limited these resources can be around hoarding disorder, but specifically about resource for family and loved ones of folks with hoarding disorders. Your expertise and voice is just so appreciated and needed. Can we start by getting to know you a little bit? Maybe you could start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about how you came to specialize in hoarding disorder.
Okay, I'm Ceci Garrett. I'm a licensed clinical social worker up in Washington State. I do telehealth as well as in person. And I got into this. People ask, how long have you been in your practice? And I say, I've only been a clinical social worker for 4 years, but I really have about 45 years of expertise. And people look at me and they're like, I don't know how old you are, but how do you have 45 years? And I'm like, when we moved out of my grandparents' home, my mother's low-lying clutter issues really became magnified. So how did I get here? I grew up with a parent who had hoarding behaviors, but I didn't have language for that. In the 80s, 90s, even the early 2000s, most families and individuals who had these behaviors didn't have clinical language, and it was very secret, covered with shame. We don't talk about it. Even extended family members generally don't talk about it until there's a crisis. And so in 2009, like many other adult children waiting for the phone call, I got the phone call that something had happened, and my mother ended up having to be removed from her home through a kitchen window, hospitalized, nearly lost a leg, which then ended up with us featured on the show Hoarders on A&E that fall. And after that, I determined that I needed to do something, that there were others like myself who were struggling with this. And I started an adult child's group, which for every person who called or reached out as an adult child, I actually had 5 people in the community reach out and say, I don't know if my kids have any issues, but I think I'm a hoarder. And I was like, I can't help you. I'm just an adult child. I can't do that. And of course, it was traumatic for me. But I found Buried in Treasures by Dr. Frost and Lee Shure, and actually was one of the very first people outside of the Boston area to offer that in the Spokane community. And long story short, went from being a paraprofessional peer facilitator to getting my degree in clinical social work, training all of my instructors along the way in hoarding disorder. And now that's what I do. My current caseload is 100% either people with hoarding behaviors or loved ones of people with hoarding behaviors.
What an incredible journey. And it is just so, to me, incredible when people take their pain and they turn it into such purpose and are able to take that lived experience, but then really honing a clinical craft and expertise in it. How amazing that you were able to use this to reach so many people and I'm sure transform so many lives. But again, sharing that you were on Amy's Hoarders is also fascinating to me for what you were sharing, and that me growing up in the 90s, I don't think this languaging of hoarding disorder was known and available. I don't think it was seen through a lens of health or mental health. And I think that show was really formative for putting it in the collective consciousness. And it sounds like for children, adult children, that light bulb of recognizing and maybe feeling seen, and that there is this community out there that understood and they weren't alone and having this experience in their home if it was like very shielded and protected and secret. But also it sounds like it also ignited some insight in people who may be suffering with hoarding behaviors as well, which is really fascinating. Yeah, so that's really gives us some great background and foundation of how this kind of put you on the path. For clinicians who may not be as familiar, can we get clear on definitions? How do you define hoarding disorder and what distinguishes it from collecting or clutter?
Okay, so clutter. What is clutter? Let's start there. Clutter, really, I love several of the professional organizers have coined this definition of what is clutter. Clutter is simply a postponed decision. It doesn't necessarily mean that an item doesn't belong in our space or in our lives. It just means that in a given moment, we are postponing a decision about where it goes, where it's going to be used, or sometimes it's cluttered because it doesn't belong and we're postponing the decision or the action to take care of it. So almost everybody, I will say we do have these extreme Spartans who have now come into kind of view, but the majority of us have some clutter in our homes, this collection of things that just maybe we haven't found the right spot to store, or we use it so frequently we're hesitant to put it away, but we don't really have a good spot for it. So clutter is pretty normative. Collecting usually is one or two categories. So we see somebody, I think of growing up, my grandmother had a neighbor who collected the little Hummel figurine, and she had a nice 2 different wall curios where she displayed these. But she didn't have multiples of everything in her home. She had specifically Hummels. So that's collecting. We have one or two categories. Now, can collecting get to be pathological, overwhelming? Sure. I think of a show that came out in the early 2000s on one of the networks, Extreme Collectors. And there was this one guy who had, I think, 4,000 different cans of beer, unopened cans, on display. it's a value, right? Like to me, certainly wouldn't want my husband to display 4,000 unique cans of beer in my home, but it's a personal choice. And sure, collections can be small, they can be very pervasive and large. Again, it comes off as being a little different. So then, if we all have clutter, if most of us have collections and collections can become too large, then what is hoarding? Well, hoarding involves clutter, but clutter isn't really the key piece. Clutter is about executive functioning, and that's only one piece of it. When we're looking at hoarding disorder, the clinical definition says that there has to be a persistent difficulty discarding or parting with items. So persistent means it's not something that's just happened the last 6 months since grandmother died and we came into all of her things, right? That's a grief response. And if it continues long term, but we need that persistent longer term trouble. So we have difficulty. Why do we have difficulty? Because the individual either has a strong emotional attachment to things, unhelpful beliefs about the things, or they simply just can't tolerate the discomfort that comes with making bad decisions, what they perceive could be a bad decision. So we have that inability to let go because of these cognitive pieces. So when we have difficulty letting go of things, we get this accumulation of clutter. And when is clutter pathological and hoarding? The definition says when it creates challenges to using the home as designed. So that means that we're no longer able to cook in our kitchens. Perhaps a bathroom has become a storage closet for clothing and we can't bathe there. It could be that the dining room table is there, but nobody can actually sit at it and use it. Now, there is this interesting caveat where we can we can diagnose hoarding disorder when there's not the same level of clutter, but the reason that there's not the same level of clutter is because of the intervention or presence of third parties. So I'll see this sometimes in couples or in people with families where they're living with the family members and the family members are really working hard to keep the clutter at bay. So walking into their home, I actually have two clients who walking into their homes, almost everybody would say, there's no hoarding here. And I'm like, that's not the case at all. The case is it's confined to specific areas and the clients are working on the process of letting go, taking on their beliefs. So we have to be really careful when we look at clutter to understand, is it in fact because of this? Because it could be depression, right? Deep depression, we simply lack the emotional and physical energy to make decisions. When we do that, we get a body double in there or someone to assist, they make decisions really quickly. Now, can they have a very full home? Yes, but they're not having difficulty making the decisions. They're having difficulty with the emotional and physical energy required to remove things. We also see persistence of interest in items like in autism, where when somebody has an ASD disorder and they collect lots of a certain type of thing, we're not going to say it's necessarily hoarding. We may see hoarding behaviors there, but we're not going to give them a primary diagnosis of hoarding disorder. And then, of course, stroke victims, traumatic brain injury, there are some of these medical conditions and other mental health conditions where we wouldn't diagnose hoarding disorder.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're ruling out for some like organic brain issues that may be coming up, or if there is a differential that may otherwise explain some of these behaviors, but either seeing that like obstruction to the utility of the home or just really that presence of that main factor of the difficulty in decision making of releasing comes, and that could be for a caveat of different emotional experiences. Something, and I've seen it a lot in my experience of is like these two cultural moments coming together of having folks that may have like parents that were like depression era and or they're immigrant, like children of immigrants or immigrants themselves, they get a lot of messages about waste, whether that be food waste or physical waste. And that also be coupled with an intense consumption culture. So they're having access to bringing more things in than they ever have. And then they simultaneously have a lot of waste fears about and manifest in like difficulty in getting rid of things and having this accumulation of hoarding behaviors over time. So it's really fascinating to hear like the ways you're distinguishing it. And I think that's a really helpful definition to get us into this conversation. What are some of the most common misconceptions you encounter about hoarding, especially among clinicians or families, the public? What are some of the things you're hearing that sort of don't sit quite right with you?
I hear a lot of clinicians specifically asking why we're not doing ERP. And I think it's a really important thing that although right now the DSM-5 TR does still have hoarding disorder in the section with OCD and related disorders, as we continue to do the research, we actually are finding that there's more and more reasons to say this isn't an obsessive compulsive disorder. The parts of the brain activated, the treatments, the medications, they really just don't fit. And in fact, I think there's a strong possibility. I've heard murmurs that in future DSMs, it may fall somewhere else because actually there's more correlation with ADHD, so that executive function capacity challenges, and then also with trauma. And again, we remember that compulsive behaviors are not uncommon in response to past trauma. So that's one. And the reason we don't do ERP is because hoarding concerns are ego syntonic, not ego dystonic. And what does that mean for anybody who maybe, because I know sometimes people are like, I don't even know what you just said. Even therapists are like, I've never heard this term. Ego syntonic means that it's consistent with who I believe I am. In OCD, the concerns, the obsessive doubts are typically ego dystonic. So a young mom has intrusive thoughts that she's going to stab her newborn infant. She's horrified because at her core, she believes she's a good mother. And these obsessional doubts then are horrible for her because they're not consistent with who they are. The obsessional doubts in hoarding, however, are ego syntonic. They are consistent with who the person believes they are. These are their values. I'm responsible. I make good decisions. I take care of the environment. I'm responsible to myself and others. And so those values and who they believe they are also the places where they have this obsessional doubt. And so I'm just going to tell you, if you try to expose me to content that is who I say I am and to force me to do behaviors that are inconsistent with that and think that I'm going to get better, it makes sense that straight ERP wouldn't be necessarily helpful. That said, there is exposure work and effective treatments for hoarding disorder. We just don't present it the same way. I absolutely have my clients doing exposure work and consolidation around what have you learned about your belief versus what happened, which really does harken to exposure therapy, but I'm simply not using the same rationale. So that's one for clinicians. For family members, there's a lot there. One is going to be, and I want to preface this with this understanding that health and safety is important, absolutely. And there are times where we have to step in and do something pretty aggressively. The challenge is I hear family members say, we've got to do something on the one hand, and on the other hand saying, we need to get mom, dad, sister, brother, cousin into therapy. There's these natural consequences that have to occur for someone typically to gain enough insight that they have a problem. But these families are really enmeshed and there's a lot of accommodation. And I also want to be really clear, as an adult child myself, I want to be really compassionate and clear here. When we talk about accommodation, it comes out of anxiety. It comes a lot out of the research on anxiety and families and family accommodation. And this construct was really meant for parents who are accommodating their child. They were not making their child engage with content that brought up anxiety. When you're a child and you're forced to change your behaviors as a survival mechanism in your family of origin, you're not choosing to accommodate. It is a survival technique, and it's gotten you this far. So I want to be compassionate. I'm not judging, but at the same time, we have to then come back and go, what am I doing that's actually taking away natural consequences that might force my loved one to recognize I have a problem and I need some help. And so reducing accommodation, and that can be very small, that can be very big. It just depends on the scenario. But I think that's a big piece. And families rushing in to alleviate on large scale these health and safety risks. To some extent, nobody wants to see a family member fall and get hurt in their home. But if we don't allow some of these things to happen, recognizing where our power is and where our loved one's power is or should be, we're actually robbing them of the opportunity to do the work. We clean out too much. Then they finally engage with therapy, and there's nothing to do this work of increasing awareness and making decisions, taking on values and shifting it so that they can do it. So we also have to be really careful about that.
Yeah.
So those are the big ones. The public, the biggest misunderstanding, and I would say this applies to everybody, that it's about the stuff. It's really not about the stuff. Even the stories that my clients tell me about their things, it's really not about stuff. It's about attachment. It's about emotional dysregulation. It's about feeling better when something is just stressing. And we all do that in some way, shape, or form. And we really stigmatize hoarding by talking and focusing on the stuff and on shaming them because they've really turned to something that's culturally, you mentioned at the beginning, this overconsumption, this waste not, want not. If you're going to have an addiction or an unhealthy behavior with something, in some ways, having it with possessions is a lot safer for a period than most other things that we could become reliant upon.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think that's such an important piece of understanding the function of the behavior and recognizing this is not dissimilar to what folks who are not suffering with hoarding behaviors are doing. It's just manifesting in a different way. And some of those behaviors may be more neutral or positive. Some of them may be more dangerous to an individual's health or community health. And I think that piece you were weaving before about these being egocentric behaviors, also that understanding that accommodation, it being so interfering because they are not necessarily having the same experience of the distress to the stuff. So that is not going to cultivate intrinsic motivation to change the behavior when they're getting all of these gains if it's making them feel safe in other ways. So if not having some buy-in because they're seeing how it's creating problems that actually resonate as problems for them, how are we going to authentically get them to care about this in a way that's going to be worth giving up what's probably some sort of creative survival strategy to navigate their world? Moving into the impact on families and relationships, what kind of emotional and relational tolls does hoarding disorder tend to have on family members, friends, or caregivers?
Yeah, so I think to understand the impacts on relationships is really to go back to those underlying challenges, attachment to possessions instead of to people. So how that plays out for family members often is my mom, my dad, my spouse seems to be more interested in their things than in me. And to some extent, having worked with this population and looking back even on my own childhood experiences, I understand better now that it wasn't that my mom actually cared about her things more than she cared about me. It's that she had disorganized, anxious attachment with people. And I know enough about her family of origin trauma experiences, adult trauma experiences to go, okay, if she weren't my mom, I can see why she did that and how that made sense. Things were safe. Things don't leave. Things don't say bad words. Things don't abuse. And so I understand that. At the same time, however, family members often are like, but I just want them to spend time with me. Spouses come in and say, hey, I get that they need to take their time to make these decisions, but they're spending 3 hours a day sorting and they're already at work 8 hours a day. And the only thing I get is when they're already done all of their sorting and I'm getting what's left over and they're tired, irritated, and not available to me. I just want to spend time with my spouse. And so that piece, the attachment to things instead of to people, is one of the things that when I start to see a client shifting, their family members start to see the shift, I know we're going to have long-term success. When they're turning to social supports instead of to things for a sense of attachment, safety, and security. The other piece that's really important is the emotional dysregulation. If you're in an environment with somebody who's emotionally dysregulated, and I'm speaking to all the clinicians out there, we all have those clients that we know are coming in emotionally dysregulated. And we're preparing for that session, knowing that we're going to have to be on our A game to stay self-regulated in hopes of pulling that. But if you're a family member with somebody who has emotional dysregulation, especially if it's your parent, you were supposed to have learned those skills from your parent, and you didn't learn those. And now the most successful resolution of this is for you to get them yourselves. And I'm just going to say, there's still a 5-year-old inside of me that says in the back of my head all the time, it's not fair that I had to go to therapy to learn how to self-regulate so that I could co-regulate my mother. It's not fair, right? And here's the thing, I'm never going to tell that 5-year-old that it was fair because it's not. That's not how it's designed. We're designed with mirror neurons, as many mammals are, to learn these skills from our caregivers. And those of us who grew up in these environments, we didn't learn that. And so it's going to impact our relationships. And it's going to not only impact our relationship with our loved one who hoards, but if we don't know how to self-regulate because we didn't learn it, because we're in these dysregulated environments so much, we are probably tainting most of our other relationships as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that reminder you were giving before that it's not about the stuff. It's, forgive the pun, but like the space that this takes up more in terms of emotional capacity and bandwidth and time and energy. And then what gets lost because of what is getting allocated to the management of the things and the stuff is really what the focus on is on. It's those missed moments of co-regulation in childhood. It's the missing of connection and safety and quality time that happens. So it sounds like that is a big component. And now a quick word about our amazing sponsor, Jane.
Can we agree on something? Therapists are already doing enough. You're managing care, notes, scheduling, billing, all while holding space for everyone else. The last thing you need is a system that makes it harder. That's why I switched to Jane. It's intuitive, it's beautifully designed, and it just works. It saves me time and protects my energy. The customer support alone is worth it, but the smoother workflow, that's what made it a long-term solution for me. Use code AFFIRM1MO to get a 1-month grace period. Switch to Jane and see what it feels like to be supported by your EHR for once. Time to decide if Jane's a better fit.
Big thanks to Jane for supporting this podcast. And now back to the interview. Are there particular dynamics in parent, child, or partner relationships when one person is experiencing hoarding behaviors?
I think the biggest dynamic that I see is that in these systems, whether it's partner systems or family systems, and let's be clear, a partner system is still a family system, is that really what ends up happening is that the person with the hoarding behaviors becomes the center and everything is about their needs, their desires. So as a child, this means that you give up space to play. You maybe never even had it because the person who hoards is going to take up that space with their possessions. It means that you give up cultural norms. There's almost, I joke, almost like a separate culture of hoarding for these families. I don't have a ton of memories of sitting and having shared meals with my mother. I do have memories of extended family get-togethers. And of course, remember, we talked about emotional dysregulation, of my mom being emotionally dysregulated and there being family arguments. As an adult, the last place I typically want to sit is a dining room table because I'm like, this feels really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I had a Christmas tree up for 10 years, like every day for 10 years. So we see this in partner dynamics. What we see is, again, Typically, we see that the person with the hoarding behaviors has a stronger personality than their partner, and they're with somebody who is more soft spoken and who is giving up a lot of bandwidth, space, emotional needs to accommodate the person with the hoarding behaviors.
Yeah, that makes sense. What are some of the emotions that are common in loved ones? How can clinicians help normalize and validate those sort of emotional experiences that happen?
I think that the most common emotions that family members, whether it's partners or other family members, children, siblings, is resentment, that anger piece, and resentment for what the hoarding costs them. That it's not simply, even when a parent passes away, for these families, it's not uncommon then, now the loved one is gone, to be left to deal with the conditions of a home. And so not only is there grief of someone I cared about is gone, there's also often complicated bereavement because they're forced to deal with crisis level intervention without the loved one present. And so there's a lot of frustration, anger. And I just want to say this. We need to stop making anger toxic and bad. Anger has a place. I tell clients and people in support groups this all the time. I can use your anger. Anger isn't bad. Anger is not to be avoided. Anger needs to be expressed in a regulated body. And when it does, it becomes advocacy. Anger is simply an indication that something matters. And I'm going to make a t-shirt someday that says, anger in a relaxed body equals advocacy, right? Why do I do what I do? Because it angers me that there are children all across the world who still live in environments where a parent's hoarding dictates every context of their world, and very few resources exist to identify those kids and their parents and to get appropriate resources to them. So anger is there, anxiety, worry, the adult child, the spouse leaves. It's too much, I have to leave. But there's always this fear. Is it going to become catastrophic? When is it going to become catastrophic? So this hypervigilance, doorbell dread in your childhood if you live like this because you can't let somebody know how you're living, and phone dread when you leave the house, when you leave the relationship. When am I going to get that notification that something horrible has happened and I'm going to be asked to intervene? And what am I going to do, if anything?
Yeah. Well,
So as far as for clinicians, I think it's really important that we don't rush to have family members be compassionate. When we look at hoarding disorder and the impacts, we also, especially if we're talking about adult children or children still in the home, let's go out back to our ACEs survey, the ACEs questionnaire. It is possible, based purely on a family member having a hoarding behavior in a childhood home, that you have an ACE score of 4, only because you happen to be born to somebody with a hoarding disorder. That's really heavy.
Yeah.
And statistically, we're talking about somebody who, as they leave the home, is going to be at significant risk for long-term medical issues, not just mental health challenges, but medical issues, and they had no choice or control over it. So we don't want to rush a client to feel compassionate toward their parent. People ask me all the time, how have you gotten to where you are? I chose to forgive my mom, but I don't suggest that anybody else needs to get there. Is there clinical value in getting to a point where you can release someone for what they've done? Sure. But it's not for me to decide when that happens for you. That's a personal choice. So clinicians really just need to understand those experiences and how painful it is to have these experiences in a child's body, in a child's mind that's egocentric and maybe has already decided that it was all their fault.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm ready for that t-shirt, just saying that anger is appropriate here. And just that experience, it was so nice to hear you say, one, that you are treating people with hoarding disorder and you're seeing that there is more insight than maybe there is a broader belief about insight around this. And also that you framed it as an executive dysfunction issue, that there might that actually like not seeing the problem in the same way, like the
Perception.
like, right,
Yeah.
the perception of the like the things and the encroaching of stuff into these spaces is experienced differently by someone who has a hoarding disorder, maybe someone who doesn't. Because I think for a lot of the rage that I witness in terms of family members, especially children, is the invalidation, because there's oftentimes they're feeling they're met with denial about saying this is a problem and their parent telling them this isn't a problem. And so I think some of the ways that you're framing it and understanding it can make space for those folks that get there and want to get there, and there's utility to get there in being able to open up that compassion, also recognizing like you like that rage, that anger is so appropriate, and that invalidation, whether that was the intention or not, is certainly the impact and all the ways that is going to growing up in that environment is going to impact the person in ways that are going to affect their bodily and psychological and emotional safety. I think that's really an important piece of not rushing to compassion and making space for a full breath of very appropriate emotions. And we're really hearing that hoarding doesn't just affect the individual, it really ripples outward. It has a huge impact on attachment across families and bonds and sorts of really complex emotions and resentment.
I want to speak to that real quickly because it's something that has come up. I offer an Ask Me Anything about hoarding on one of my platforms for non-clinical resources. And one of the recent requests was about setting boundaries with extended family members. And this is a very real thing for adult children especially, but it's often true for spouses as well, that there is this don't talk about it secret in the extended family. And that is a really challenging piece. That this isn't like a vacuum that it's just in the family of origin. One of the most difficult things for me was hearing an aunt tell me that, yes, we knew your mother was emotionally abusive to you. Wait, what? Fortunately, I was an adult, but it was still like, oh, okay. Like, how messed up is that system that people who the child may believe or the partners may believe are safe people then say, oh, we knew and we didn't know what to do, so we didn't do anything. And so there really is this larger system. It's not happening in a vacuum, right? If you have a loved one with this, that there is probably a larger system dysfunction that exists, which is quite possibly why they turn to possessions for safety and security and attachment, because we're seeing early childhood deprivation of touch may be correlated with development of hoarding behaviors. Makes so much sense, really. But I can't go back and fix that other than to say, okay, we need to teach more new parents how important it is to hold your baby, right? Hold your baby. Don't put them in the seat. Anyways, I digress. But I feel like it's really important that people understand it's not a vacuum of just this family of origin, the nuclear family, that really does go out typically to the extended family and the dysfunction there as well.
Yeah, yeah. And like I think you guys were saying before is that those foundational coping mechanisms are there. They're just manifested in different ways. So I think the turning away, the avoiding, the meeting discomfort with denial or minimization, those broader patterns just being reflected in these family systems at large. But then this is just a more obvious, evident physical manifestation. It's easier to see and name and call out in a different way. But I think that's really, really important to name. So how can we move into how clinicians can work with families who are carrying a lot of this? How do we begin to work with loved ones who are seeking support, especially where I imagine many of the time the person with the hoarding disorder may be ambivalent about treatment or may not be ready to seek treatment at the time the family member is connected?
I would say there's 3 pieces perhaps. The first is validation of the experience. And you don't have to, as a clinician, understand hoarding to understand that if a family member or a spouse comes to you very upset about the impacts of this, we don't have to understand a lot to be able to sit with the person, see their emotions. We also need to be really careful, though, about not jumping into a lot of questions. One of the things I hear a lot of adult children say is, Cece, I'm looking for a therapist, but I'm exhausted by trying to explain hoarding to my therapist.
Yeah.
My therapist seems like a great person, but it's exhausting to have to explain it to them when I have so many needs emotionally. I don't need to educate them also. So that's really hard. So we need to just be present and validate the same way we would with somebody who's had sexual abuse. You don't have to have had sexual abuse in your own life to be able to validate and sit with that. So validation is going to be the first piece. The second piece is teach the family members emotional self-regulation and distress tolerance skills. These are environments where these things are lacking. And even if the loved one never accepts they have a problem and seeks help, the good we can do for the person in the room by making sure they have emotional self-regulation, distress tolerance skills, good interpersonal relationship skills is humongous, just so important. I think the third piece, and we may not always get there, is going to be the recognition of reducing accommodation and the person who's in the room, the family member, spouse, partner, cousin, whoever, is having them shift the relationship. Again, coming back to family systems work. I don't have to change my mother. I simply have to change my behaviors, knowing that when I change that, she will be also forced to change as she's in the system or to leave the system. Now, this is not manipulation. We are not going into therapy as family members saying, I'm going to change to force my loved one to get help. That's not what we're doing here. But when we get healthier, we're forcing the people in our relationships to also interact with us in a different way. And it can be a way to move people into greater insight, but it has to be done. And this is why teaching co-regulation, self-regulation, distress tolerance is essential, is if we're going to get to that third piece, the person in the room needs to have those skills in a huge way. Because when we force someone else to change because we've changed, we are upsetting the apple cart, so to speak, and they're going to get upset.
Yeah.
And again, these are systems with a lot of emotional dysregulation. So we have to have that as a really big piece, is validation, teaching them emotional self-regulation, distress tolerance skills. And then if there's the ability after that, then we get into them modeling healthier behaviors, reducing accommodation of their loved ones hoarding, but only after they have really those good skills in themselves developed and utilized.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. So if you have gotten someone to that third place where they are actively working on reducing accommodation, what are some practical ways they can start communicating and enforcing boundaries? Is there anything that you think about when someone is making some behavioral changes in the context of these relationships and how it can be skillfully navigated without making it an ultimatum or forcing change or dictating change to the other person?
Yeah, so I think first of all is we don't say I'm setting boundaries. I remember in like English class, like you learned back in the 90s to write business letters, and the first thing you did is you stated the purpose of writing the letter. And I always thought, really, artfully, skillfully setting boundaries isn't me saying, hey, Shaina, I'm setting a boundary here.
Okay.
That's not artful, skillful. Artful, skillful is, Shaina, thank you so much for giving me a gift. I want to reaffirm I'm not accepting gifts at this time. And if you're insistent upon giving me a gift, you're also giving me permission to do with it as I see fit, which means I might donate it. And that's just how this is going to work. I hope you understand. So I'm setting a boundary about gifts because this is one of families, inappropriate gifts, profuse gifts can be a really big piece. And then the loved one comes back, where's the plate I gave you last Christmas? And you didn't want the plate. You asked not to be given a plate or any gift. And so it's coming back and saying, oh, I'm glad you asked me about that. I want to just remind you that I'd really made it clear that I'm not accepting gifts right now. I'm happy to have you in our family interactions, but we're not doing gifts, right? And as I said before, if you leave a gift, I will choose to dispose of it as I see appropriate, as I see fit. This is my environment. And in my environment, I have intentionally kept items. And so that's just an example. It could be even more difficult. It could be not taking parents shopping, right? If you have a loved one or a spouse, not going shopping with them. If you know that they have problems with significant over acquisition, we're just not doing that anymore. So that might be a conversation of, you know what, I heard you'd really like to go to Michael's and look for some more yarn. However, I'm happy to go to lunch with you. I'm happy to meet you with the kids at the park. However, I'm not interested in going shopping. We're not going to go shopping as part of our time together. Here are some other things that I'm happy to do.
Right, right. How does that translate with partners where there might be a shared space and perhaps one of those things is about getting rid of items? Is that like an appropriate boundary to set with somebody that is suffering with hoarding disorder? If I don't have access to the restroom, like I will discard the items that are obstructing my use of the facility. Is that something that can be done? And
It's a challenging one because I'll just tell you when we're trained that we don't ever make the decision for the other person. That said, when we're talking about something significant like the ability to navigate cooking or using the restroom, I think that there has to be some level of this is what I'm going to be doing to regain the use of the restroom. And at that point, you can be part of that process. I'm not going to do it, but we have to clear this. So that's what we call harm reduction. We're not asking them to significantly change their behaviors. We're simply saying the bathroom has to be accessible and usable. Then we set those boundaries of, I see that you left this bag in front of the bathroom door. We've already worked on clearing this space, has to be maintained. And so I'm giving you an opportunity to relocate it, or I will read that as you're giving me permission to remove the item. Again, we're not going to do that in all the spaces. We're going to do those in those really critical spaces of ADLs. With a partner, this becomes a little bit different in the sense of shared spaces and both being adults and being a choice. It's a little bit different for children who don't have choice in what family they were brought into. A spouse has some choice and more freedom and power. Not always easy to do that, though. So it is a little bit different. But I will say, I found that partners do a better job of setting boundaries at times once they recognize they have the power to set a boundary.
right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad that you also named that caveat that when you're doing this work, maintaining that choice around the individual that is struggling with the hoarding disorder is a priority, and that there is nuance for these circumstances you've talked about that could really impact functioning and our safety. So it sounds like you are also saying that boundaries can coexist and they can be applied firmly, but compassionately. The way that the accommodation is pulled back is not with devaluing the person or shaming the person necessarily. Although I know you probably really mean that the anger and all of those things are very valid, but I mentioned anger and calm bodies, which I think is like a beautiful reminder. And you were mentioning there are some issues around safety, health crises, obstruction of important high utilized spaces that make a home functional, like a bathroom or a kitchen. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about when these interventions become necessary. Are there any red flags or crisis points where family members should intervene more assertively that you see?
Absolutely. There's a full bucket. So I guess one is we need to state that there's a couple of different scenarios. When we're talking about partners, so we're talking about adults in a co-shared space, but no children. When do we get involved? We get involved when we start to see health and safety risks. So what are health and safety risks? And I'm just going to tell you, because this is one that's been really challenging for me. There's something called the Uniformed Inspection Checklist. that's available and is broadly used by housing, and it includes code and HUD housing requirements. But I'm just going to tell you, Shaina, if you printed that and took it home and walked through your house, you might be a little horrified to find that you, in fact, have violations. I've dealt with housing managers who want to evict because somebody has a desk under a window. And fire code says we can't have furniture under the window. I'm just going to say, the people listening to this, I'm going to guess all of us have somewhere in our home a piece of furniture under a window. So we need to be, there's still some nuance here. When does health and safety, when we have so many things in front of a window that in a fire, we can't access the window. So yeah, we have a piece of furniture, but we also have 5 boxes, 10 bags, and no ability to actually reach the window. This is a health and safety thing. If there's a fire, we can't get out if we need to through that window. We like the light of windows, but really a lot of reasons we have windows is getting out in emergencies.
Yeah.
Using spaces as they're designed. It's essential to have the ability to make meal. I have one client who would challenge me on this. Doesn't cook much, said, I don't really care about my kitchen. Has reclaimed the kitchen and uses it some, their own level. But I would say in a shared space with 2 adults, if one person wants to be able to cook in the home, the ability to do that safely, what does that look like? That means on a stove, you need 18 inches either direction of the stove clear of clutter. And then above, there can't be things hanging from cabinets above either.
Yeah.
So these are when we get involved. Now, notice I'm talking about 18 inches on either side of the stove. I'm not talking about the whole kitchen. So we need clear pathways throughout the home into every room that is accessed. Now, if we're talking about aging adults who no longer have children at home, does that mean that all 5 bedrooms need to have paths? No, it is still going to be a health and safety risk in the case of a fire. Paramedics do not go into homes that are significantly cluttered. It's a perimeter monitoring and takedown of the fire. So if you have 5 bedrooms and 4 of them are full, chock full, we still have a health and safety. We just can't always knock down all of those. So we're going to want usable kitchen spaces. And again, not the whole kitchen. We need to be able to use the sink. We need to have low risk as far as fire around stoves and microwaves. We need to have trash that can be taken out, right? No presence of molding, rotten food. These significant bathrooms. Again, we need to be able to get in and out of bath or shower to bathe. We need to be able to get to the toilet and flush and have it repaired if needed. We need to be able to use the sink. Ideally, we need to be able to get to our bed. We need to have these pathways. Egress code says 36 inches, but I'm just going to tell you from my work, everybody in fire and life support, ambulances, paramedics, they really want 42 to 48 inches because getting a gurney, and the gurneys are going to take up every bit of 36. If we can get 42 inches or 48 inches, we're doing great. And then we want to look at, especially homes built in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s with electric baseboard heating. We need to not have clutter within, I think the current standard is still, with most of the baseboard heating, is a foot every direction. Where that's different in some states, I think of like parts of Florida and Southern California, where they have the boxes with the coils for heat, those actually have to be 36 inches in every direction. This is challenging for sure, but these are the really big pieces where we need to intervene. So again, we're talking about shared space with all adults, assuming that nobody has intellectual disabilities or significant physical challenges. Where this gets different is when we have families with children. Children need a safe place to play. They need a safe place to do homework, to eat. There needs to be the ability to make a meal. They need to have a bed. And then when do we intervene? The second we start seeing any of those things becoming infringed upon, we need to be contacting Child Protective Services to see if, in fact, resources can be brought in to assist the family. So it's a little bit different when we have children because children don't have agency the same way. They don't have the insight about the health and safety risks. But those are the places where, and again, we're going to go with a harm reduction. As a child who grew up in this environment, if you'd come in and done a mass clean out of my mother's home, I would have been emotionally abused for weeks after that. So we need to not be doing large scale cleanouts in these places. And if we're engaging with adult protective services, child protective services, code enforcement with forced intervention, and to be clear, we want to avoid those as much as possible, but sometimes they are essential. We need to make sure that we have mental health support for the families and for the individual with the hoarding behaviors, because otherwise, emotional dysregulation is going to run rampant. And you're also going to see them rebound, acquire. One study showed that within 6 months, it was 100 to 125% refilling of a forced clean out home. That hasn't done anyone any good.
Yeah. In your experience of navigating this harm reduction approach with individuals struggling with hoarding disorder and their families, is it easier to get some buy-in, understand the utility? Because you're really mapping out things very practically, like getting a gurney and getting a gurney out. Like it's
Sadly, no. What is effective is finding out what's important to the person who hoards, whether we're getting them into counseling or we're doing a harm reduction approach. If we don't get them involved in what matters to them and really leading with that and bringing in our health and safety pieces around it, we're not really necessarily going to get more buy-in in a harm reduction. They're not necessarily interested in it. And again, we're asking them to do something that feels very unsafe.
Yeah.
But if we can find out what's important to them, oh, I really would love to paint in the spare room. Cool. I would love to help you get that ability. At the same time, we need to make sure that there's a pathway to that room and to the front door, because what if something went wrong? Could you get out? Could somebody else get in? So we're more likely to get an agreement if we do some motivational interviewing, find out what their goals are, and be able to hear those, and then work the health and safety pieces around that.
Yeah, I love that. It's really centering their values and their preferences. And I could see that just being a much more affirming approach to that rather than this is for you. It's not like happening to you.
And it's really interesting. It's one of the things that the DSM-5 came out in 2013. We got this as a separate disorder, 2013. So we're 12 years in now. And it's one of the most fascinating things to me that we still treat people with hoarding disorder as though they have no power and agency or say. And we don't do this with the other disorders in nearly the same way. And I'm like, of course somebody doesn't want to have your help because you're telling them what to do. I'm a person with agency. If I have a challenge, I don't really want my doctor to tell me what to do. I want my doctor to ask me what I've tried and what I'm willing to try. And that's not typically how hoarding interventions are. Even family members, when we go into someone's house and we remove items against their will, it's functionally theft, right?
Yeah.
If you have a key, does not really change anything. And that even therapists and code enforcement, that we think that we can go in and make these huge decisions and forced intervention on somebody is a little baffling, right? We've got to get better at finding out what the person wants. And I find that once I do that with clients, even the most resistant, mandatory clients actually want to stay in therapy and to work with me. And I think it's because for the first time, someone hasn't told them what to do, has allowed them to share what their hopes and dreams are. And what am I doing? I'm becoming their secure attachment base. And that's going to be a really big thing. And when we have secure attachment, we will try hard things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just love how I think, again, you like just reframing and reorienting understanding of hoarding through the lens of executive dysfunction and trauma. And then it sounds recognizing that some of the practices have been inherently not trauma informed, and you putting choice and voice really in the center of these experiences. So I can understand why people are having such a unique experience for you that maybe like what treatment as usual has been, particularly from more of these like systemic frameworks. How do you see these agencies playing a role? Where do they help? Where do they create harm in your experience?
So I'd say they can do both. They
Yeah.
can be helpful, they can create harm. As family members really don't have power the way agencies do, right? One thing I want to be really clear here, because I think there's a huge misunderstanding about the intervention of CPS and APS. APS does not legally have the right to force their way into a home in any state. That is not part of what APS is. CPS is very different. CPS has the right to force entry and to inspect a home in a report. And so this is something that I think clinicians misunderstand and agencies misunderstand and even family members misunderstand. Why is an APS going in? Because they don't have the power to do that. That said, agencies are in the place of power and being the person, we talk about the carrot and the stick. Agencies should be the stick. Family members should not be the stick.
Mhm.
And with deep respect for agencies, agencies often expect the family members to be the stick. And then are frustrated that family members won't be involved and are angry at the agencies. And so I want to say that they can be helpful, they can also be harmful. I've heard reports of agencies investing tens of thousands of dollars in harm reduction. There's absolutely no reason an agency should be spending that much money on a harm reduction intervention. If that's where we're at, then the person shouldn't be able to maintain that space. That's really a space that we either did too much or it wasn't a space that we should have stayed in. We look at CPS. If we go in and we force a clean out to stabilize the home environment for a child, but we aren't including mental health for the child and for the parents and recognizing that this is a dysregulated family system, we have absolutely opened the child up to potentially more harm than the environment was beforehand. And that's a really hard thing, I think, for people to understand. But having lived it, I didn't have CPS involved, but I tried to do small scale cleanouts for my mom and how long she would be dysregulated. And not just one time, like for multiple days, a certain section of the house, she'd see it and and we need to be really aware that's what's happening when we leave. And these kiddos don't have any skills to navigate that mom and dad are pissed off all the time now. And at least before I couldn't play, but they weren't always mad. And now they're just always mad. And now they're also acquiring more. And who's going to help? There's that sense. And oftentimes adult children say, hey, CPS was involved and they never fixed it. It was just a cycle. And now they don't trust anybody.
Yeah.
Code enforcement was a little different because they can only do exterior unless they're invited in. There's that. But there are other agencies that can be involved. Meals on Wheels can notice when a house, in some areas you have a post office, the postman will make reports that there's noticed change in a property and that they can have somebody go and do just an exterior walk around to see, is this something where we need to get additional eyes on? CARES teams throughout the country are engaged. So when we have increased falls, so we're having paramedics show up to the home repeatedly because somebody's fallen in the house and it's high volume clutter. That's an agency that then can hopefully move someone towards some sort of intervention, whether that's APS, CPS. But what's hard is we have a lot of people who are having this who don't fall within CPS world or APS world. And so we've got some holes still in our ability to intervene.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it interesting. I know you languaged a couple different ways at different times. You just said high volume clutter. When you're working with a family or individual that meets criteria of hoarding disorder, are you naming it as hoarding behaviors? Are you calling it high volume clutter? Is there more compassionate language, more preferred language?
If you're not a clinician, you shouldn't be talking about hoarding disorder. You need to have the ability to diagnose to say hoarding disorder. So the hoarding word, the H word, a lot of people are really like, has this very negative connotation. And so where I've come with it is we call it high volume clutter or high clutter because that's what most people have the ability to say, there's a lot of stuff. It's high clutter.
Yeah.
When do we need to include the H word? If we are making a report to an agency, we probably need to say, hey, we think there's hoarding behaviors. Noticing that if you're not a clinician, you don't need to say there's a hoarding disorder because you don't have the right to make that decision. So when do we need to have that conversation with the person? When we're trying to get them to seek outside help from a mental health professional who is going to have to give a diagnosis for treatment planning and insurance billing, it's going to be really important that we start using that H word. But we can do in a way that's compassionate. So we can talk about, I know you really like to go out and get new things, and it makes you feel good when you find that new thing. And then you come home and there's not a really good place to put it because there's so many things already there. So you really like to seek and you like to save. And we look at the compassion-focused therapy model for hoarding intervention, and it really looks at hoarding disorder based on these three drives, and that one is seeking, one is saving. And then we really need to get back to a compassionate balance where we're not one or the other, out of balance. And so I will often use that seeking and saving. It's evolutionary. We all do it. We had to prolong the human race. It was essential, but it's out of balance. And then we say, oh, and they have this thing called hoarding that really encompasses when those two things happen together. And it's important if they're going to show up in my office that somebody, because one of the first things I'm going to do as a professional is I'm going to disclose that I'm an expert in hoarding disorder. And if they have never heard this word and they're sitting in my office, we're going to lose them really quickly. So high volume clutter is for people who are not clinicians, who don't actually have the ability to say, yes, it's a hoarding disorder. We can talk about seeking and saving, which is a safer, and most people will say, yes, I like to find new things. Yes, I have trouble letting go. I like to save my things. We bring in hoarding when we're wanting to talk about maybe needing for change and getting outside agencies involved. And hoarding disorder really comes in with the clinician who has the ability to go, yes, I've done a full assessment. They meet criteria on this assessment. The structured interview, our Saving Inventory Revised, SIR, is our most common assessment that we want to use for diagnosis, in addition to a structured interview for hoarding disorder as therapists before we say, yes, this person has hoarding disorder.
Yeah, that's so helpful. I love the sort of neurobiological framework that you're giving folks, as I think that's such a way to reduce shame without even having to name shame, of just saying, you're wired for this. It makes sense. And is it workable in this current context that you're living in terms of your having this for hobbies and your interests and your relationships and all of these working pieces. Maybe we could just end on some concrete support for families, for clinicians. Are there resources, books, website support groups that you would recommend to either families or clinicians that are supporting loved ones with hoarding behaviors?
Yeah, certainly. As far as for clinicians, and I want to say this, straight CBT as it's written for hoarding disorder is not overly effective. I use CBT elements absolutely in my work, but I do a lot of trauma-informed and somatic interweaves, and that's why my clients come, stay engaged, and make progress. Straight CBT is behavior-driven. It's about changing behaviors. It's about exposures. And again, as we mentioned earlier, that ego syntonic, if we're doing straight exposure work, they're going to be resistant to it because we're basically saying who you are isn't good and we need to force you to change through exposure. I don't know. I'm not signing up for that in anything in my life. So we use those elements. Great places for some more resources. So the International OCD Foundation has been a driver of a lot of research around hoarding. They fund and they have several amazing researchers that are part of their hoarding work, and they have on their website a separate page for hoarding disorder. That's iocdf.org/hoarding. So that's a place. Then ADAA, it is Anxiety and Depression Association of America. But ADAA.org is another organization that has a fair bit on their website about hoarding disorder. If you are a therapist who recognizes that you have a client, especially if you have a client with ADHD, past trauma, there's a really strong possibility. We're saying 3 to 6% of the population, probably right around 5%, is hoarding impacted, which means if you work with trauma, you work with anxiety, you work with ADHD, you're going to end up with a client who has this. It's a counterintuitive treatment because we're not focusing on the stuff, although our diagnostics, our assessment, our DSM is focused on the stuff. Effective treatment is not as focused on the stuff. So if you end up with that client, remember your ethical code requires you to be competent in treating. Get professional consultation from somebody who is experienced in working with hoarding disorder. Again, IOCDF has groups periodically for hoarding disorder. It's hard to get into. So I also offer group consultation monthly, and I do it in groups to make it really affordable. Another resource for training would be the Center for Hoarding and Cluttering. This would be more appropriate not to clinicians, but to people in agencies, case managers, housing agencies, code enforcement who are looking for understanding of the disorder and what they're encountering. If you're a family member, resources are even harder to come by. There are a couple of groups online. There is a group called Children of Hoarders that is a nonprofit that's not really structured. It's just a place where people who identify as being the child of a person with hoarding behaviors can go connect. They have a Facebook page. They have a website as well. There's also on Reddit a subreddit called Child of Hoarder, which is a very active group, and I assist them from time to time. And I do also run support groups myself once a month. It's called SOPHMI, SOPHMI, Survivors of Parental Hoarding and Mental Illness. I do have some non-clinical resources that I've created. Adult Parents Who Hoard Workbook, which is a free downloadable workbook for family members, adult children, but other family members might benefit. It's really about pre-planning when to get involved and how much to get involved. And it's based on my own experience of having to have a crisis and all the things I wish I'd known that I didn't know. And I thought, I'm just going to create a resource because it's a really challenging place to be. And you can't know what you don't know. But at once, then you can create resources to help others. So we've got that out there as well. Again, we'll share links for anybody who might be interested in that. There is a book called Children of Hoarders, written by Fugan Nesreglu. It's really focused on how to be a supportive family member in getting your parent to decrease clutter. And I'll just say, there's nothing in the book that I'm opposed to. However, I think that one of the hardest pieces, and it's not expected in any other mental health disorder, is the idea that adult children should be a significant part of remediating their parents' mental health issues.
Yeah.
And so, well written, great heart, everything is found there. However, I think that we need to also really be aware that growing up in this environment may mean that the parent that you needed, emotionally present, accessible, some of the social and cultural norms that your peers had just weren't there, and that the resources we need are to really address those pieces first. One training I'm doing with an organization is we need families, but families need us first.
Yeah, absolutely. I could talk to you all day. This is such an incredible conversation. I'm just so grateful for your expertise. Can you let folks know how they can connect with you, find the important work you're doing, find the resources that you mentioned in terms of your workbook, your consultation group? What's the best way to find all of that and connect with you?
I've been doing this for a bit. So if you just Google my name, Ceci Garrett and hoarding, you're going to get pages and pages of resources and social media. I've done TEDx, so I'm on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel where I do the Ask Me Anything about hoarding videos, post those. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I have several websites. My practice website is Lightening, LIGHTENING, theloadcounseling.com. And then I do have a pen site, which again, when you Google, and I know you said you'll post some links, I have a pen site place for non-clinical, so not therapy, So coaching and other resources for primarily for adult children, but there's other information there. The Ask Me Anything was created for adult children, but it's open to therapists and other family members, even people with hoarding behaviors. They want to post a question. Now, I might have to slow it down I got 2 questions in the last 2 days, and I was like, oh, these are picking up. I might have to slow the roll on them a little bit. But the best way to create resources is not for me to try to guess what everybody means. It's to have people ask questions and then to respond. And then we know what people are looking for. So I really enjoyed doing that.
Amazing. Thank you again so much for being here. I loved our conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for joining our community on the Affirming Minds podcast. If you loved this episode as much as we did, please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts and share it on your socials. If you want more information about how this podcast can add to your continuing education credits, visit affirmmentalhealth.com. And remember, let's affirm, heal, and grow together.